Welcome to episode 21 of Responsible AI in Action. I'm your host, Charles Dimov, CMO of Comma.ai, the leader in responsible AI technology. In today's episode, we will discuss designing trustworthy, accountable AI as it moves from written answers to real world actions with implications. Dr. Jennifer Boger joins me to discuss this important topic. Dr. Boger is a thought leader at the intersection of academia and industry. She specializes in applied AI and human-centered technology design. Jennifer is a principal at Atomic 47 Labs and adjunct professor at the University of Waterloo and UBC. In addition to that, she's also a research scientist at the UW Research Institute for Aging. Jennifer focuses on building low effort, high impact systems. She's known for advancing frameworks like ethical by design and zero effort technology, which helps organizations rethink how responsible technology is developed and deployed. So, frankly, that instantly makes her one of our favorites on this video cast. Jennifer's perspective brings a highly practical and human focused lens to responsible AI. With that, welcome, Jennifer. Thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
And Jennifer, why don't we jump right in? So the first question that I have for you is, you and I had discussed biased answers in AI. We know that it's there. It's, it's a fairly common topic. That and hallucinations, I think, are the two favorite topics in AI technology these days. Now, from our earlier conversation, you pointed out that it's neither inherently good nor bad, which was interesting. That caught my interest for sure. It depends on the context you mentioned. So how should organizations think about bias more intelligently rather than just trying to eliminate it entirely? What are your thoughts there?
Right. So my first thought is you cannot eliminate bias entirely. We can't do it in humans. We can't do it in technology. And this has to do with a lot of reasons. And I certainly urge anyone who's looking at implementing AI or looking at playing with AI in their work, especially in your workspace. But regardless, if you decide you want to start playing with AI, especially agentic systems where they're making decisions autonomously behind the scenes, really important to understand what bias is, how it can impact decision making, and most importantly, how to surface what biases may be present so that you can be aware of them and you can think about how to check for them, how to mitigate them, and whether, frankly, the application is appropriate for what you're trying to do. A great example is data bias. We hear about that all the time. This is when there's a data set that has been collected and the people collecting it took certain information from a certain context. Right there, you're biasing it with why the information was collected, who is collecting it, for what purpose. All these things are going to add a slant to the data. You can't get around this just because it's discrete, right? If there's discrete data, then there's only so much bandwidth. And on top of it, the people may not even be aware that they're biasing the data in the first place. So in and of itself, that's not a terrible thing as long as we can express or articulate what the biases in that data are that we're aware of, that we're thoughtful about if we're taking that data and applying it, especially when we're applying it in a different context than the one it was intended for or collected for. That's where you have to be very careful in terms of, are you carrying slants on the data or lenses or perspectives that are inherent in a data set? Are you then taking that and trying to apply it somewhere else where the data may or may not be appropriate? Right. And what are some of the risks of doing so? So, if you're an enterprise looking at jumping into this, you're really going to want some data scientists who understand bias on your team to start really helping you around those sorts of questions so you can think strategically and carefully about that. But even as an everyday user of an LLM like Claude, say, fantastic question is when you're working with it, just pause and ask it. Where might there be biases in what I'm doing? What might they be? And what are some things I might think of? It's one of my favorite prompts because it surfaces all sorts of angles that you probably haven't thought of a lot of them, but you're like, oh yeah, that's a good question. That is an assumption I'm making and
Mm.
operating on that, has significant impact. And so that gives you the opportunity to reset your thinking and to, yeah.
That is absolutely a fantastic idea. I mean, I'm I'm going to go out on a limb here and kind of suggest that, I doubt that many corporations really have given that a lot of thought. And and that's kind of a bit concerning that there's a lot of projects going on these days. We're seeing, and I'm not sure that people have thought that through entirely. And I love your suggestion as well of saying, even as an individual user of whatever the system might be, ChatGPT or Claude or Copilot, et cetera, that's a brilliant idea to basically say, yes, what exactly is the bias that we have either in your answer or even in the question itself,
Yeah.
just
And,
to
and,
just to
and in,
further understand it.
yeah, exactly. In the work, you've been doing, my best guinea pigs are always my family. And so my husband,
Right.
who works a lot in software data agility space, and he started using AI in his practice, as many as us have. And I'm like, how are you biasing stuff? And he's like, what do you mean? And I'm like, just ask it this question. He's like, oh, okay, Jen. And, he did on like a user story or something
Yeah.
and like,
Yeah.
lo and behold, he's like, oh my gosh. I'm like, yep. It's literally a question that it doesn't matter what the sector or the topic
Yeah.
area is,
Yeah.
there's bias to be had. The other one that's very powerful is to do something, they often do this in HCI, in human computer interaction, is think about different perspectives and then asking AI to look specifically from a different lens. So if you're doing some model building, I find it really interesting to take a perspective that you feel is totally not related and throw it in there. Like,
Mhm.
what
Mhm.
would a farmer in sub-Saharan Africa
Mhm.
say? Think of the system I'm building. And what that can do is surface some unexpected ideas that you think that that's not an applicable thing to do in, say, a business modeling system for Canada. But you'd be
Yeah.
surprised at some of, again, the inherent biases we're operating under, when you take a more kind of extreme or very different perspective and throw it in there, it surfaces some perspectives that actually are applicable to your context space too. But it gives you a lens or a filter that's a very different perspective. And I mean, you can choose to ignore some of it, but some of it will be useful.
I love the idea, or actually the fact that we've given our listeners a concrete opportunity for them to actually take something back right now and apply it in their own work, and just to see what type of biases are they bringing into their own work, whether it be coding or whether it be writing or whatever their applications of AI are. So excellent. Thank you for that. Thank you a lot for that. Actually, I'm going to try it myself too
I was going to say,
to
what are
see.
you going to ask?
I have a little bit of hesitation only from the perspective of saying, oh gosh, I wonder what I'm going to discover about my own biases. But anyway, we're going to do it regardless. So that's excellent. All right, moving on to the next question. So most real world systems, they operate kind of in this gray zone. It's somewhere between autonomous. We're hearing an awful lot in the press about calling systems agentic AI. I'm not convinced that they're really agentic. I don't believe that we're there yet, but regardless, we're hearing a lot of it. So there's that, the gray zone between these fully autonomous systems and fully deterministic systems. Now, why is the middle ground so important? Why do organizations struggle to design for this?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I feel like, oh, this is a tough topic. The first thing that pops to mind is the walk before you run paradigm,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So I think one thing is important is that we treat AI as a capability, not as a software. A lot of people and organizations treat AI as perhaps a system or a software. It's not, it's much deeper, it's a capability. In terms of and it's going to impact your entire organization in terms of your systems, in terms of your people, in terms of your abilities and outcomes, in terms of like, for example, if you choose to adopt AI in an organization, who is the person in it who is the owner of AI implementation, right? Who has, access to the board and leadership? Who has the ability to do some decision making? Who brings in all the different heads of the different aspects of your business to actually backbone it and make it run? And it's not a one and done thing, it's a long-term strategic goal, right? So starting off with that framing, and the reason I'm going there is we're moving from deterministic systems, kind of hard-coded if then else systems. And whether, and to your point, we could have a long discussion, of course, about agentic and how do we decide when things are agentic, but we are moving there. I think that's something we can all agree on, whether we're there or not yet. We're going that way fast. So the challenge now is for organizations to move from our classic, in air quotes, deterministic systems to embrace the idea of having agentic, at least where it makes sense. And again, that's a big point too. Not every system needs to be agentic, right? There's certain aspects that do just fine and maybe even are correctly better to be deterministic. And, fine, do that. And there's other areas where it makes sense in terms of efficiency and task type and all and risk level and all the other considerations to make them agentic. And so it's really important that we look at strategic plans for enterprises that align with who they are, their capacity, their goals, their resources, how fast or slow they want to become, more or less. And so that's the gray, to your point, that gray middle ground that most of us are finding ourselves in now is this transition time. But what I think we don't, or are having trouble getting our heads around, is there's no end point. It's a journey. We're launching ourselves on a journey of becoming AI capable, because it's a capability as organizations, but we're not ever going to get there. It's like we are starting a different way of doing things as organizations. And what that looks like is dependent on each specific instance.
And I do like your perspective on, I think too many people have kind of jumped the gun these days and are just thinking, okay, great, we're going to implement AI and we're going to kind of let it loose. And frankly, we should always kind of bring in this concept of agentic AI and give the system autonomy and let it go. But the thing that I liked about your answer was basically saying there are applications which should maybe once agentic actually is here, because again, I think you and I agree that it's not quite. A lot of chatter, but no reality just yet. It doesn't mean that it's not coming. Of course, it's coming. We're on that path. But there's also places where we don't necessarily need it to go off and be autonomous. I just need it to do the job. Here you go, little application, go for it, etc. So again, good perspective on that side. Now, we had another really, really interesting conversation that I definitely resonated with me because it was a bit of anyway, it was just really, really interesting. Now, when we talked earlier, we spoke about, you gave me a really powerful example of AI landing airplanes. And you mentioned, on a particularly big airplane, a jumbo jet or something along those lines, you might have 4 different redundant AI systems kind of communicating and making decisions. Now, these are highly trusted, highly regulated, highly constrained systems. What can leaders learn from the world of aviation? I mean, this is, I'm just going to leave it there. What can leaders learn from that world of aviation? And specifically, let's talk a little bit about trustworthy AI automation in companies, besides the idea of you can't afford for your AI to make a mistake, for example.
Yeah, it's a great example because I think it's also very relatable to most people. Most people have flown on a plane, or at least they understand what flying on an airplane looks like and is. So to be clear, there are autopilot systems that fly the plane. They are, for the most part, deterministic systems right now. But they have built AI systems that can fly planes, and they are being tested and used in cases such as really poor visibility where there's no, where the deterministic system cannot make decisions, where there's limited information that allows the other systems to run, including the pilots, for example. So that's an example of clearly high risk. Anything to do with our bodies suddenly becomes more real. I always use this example, right? It's like if it is something that can physically happen to us, it really helps us see the nuances better. So I do like case studies like airplanes, self-driving cars, etc., because they allow us to surface deeper concepts that are still applicable to systems like a finance system, but those systems are more abstract and harder to see. So one thing about aviation, high risk, but also, highly constrained, all things considered, a lot of sensors, a lot of historical data, highly regulated, right? Lots of procedures there, clear accountability. There's a really important part. When things go wrong, who's responsible? How do you even determine who's responsible? And this is something we are really struggling with right now with AI. If you have an agentic system that is autonomously making decisions, how does responsibility go? Right? So it's a really excellent question. And it's not saying, okay, never use those systems is a clearly not a practical answer, but rather, we need to spend more time thinking about the procedures and the safeguards, the guardrails around the systems. Another, if I can, here's another example that really kind of brings it down is a knife, right? A knife is a tool. If you are not trained on how to use a knife, you are going to cut yourself a lot more. You're going to make a lot more mistakes. You can make a salad with a knife. You can kill someone with a knife. It's like what it's used for and the risk level depends on who's using it and what they're trying to do with it. A toddler with a knife versus a trained chef with a knife is a really different paradigm. But what is important is when you pick up a knife and you're learning how to use a knife, you're going to cut yourself. It's going to happen at some point. Things are going to go wrong. And so then what happens? Do you know where the Band-Aids are? Like, how do you stop the bleeding? When things are really bad, do you know where the hospital is? Like that sort of, and so we can take that use case to putting AI in higher risk situations. I'm oversimplifying a lot, but a lot of the same principles apply. How are you going to train people to use it properly? What's your emergency response going to look like? Do you have backup for if it's a really bad because that is going to happen sometimes? Where's the hospital? How do you get there, right? And how do you determine like what sort of tests you have to run to start trusting it in higher risk use cases, right? And who is responsible at the end of the
And the
day?
responsible part, I think that's a really good point that you raised because it's not quite as simple as let's look at deterministic systems. That so far that's the world we've lived in which case, if your software screwed up badly enough, then we would typically, our knee-jerk reaction or whatever it might be, our presumption is, of course, well, it's the company that developed it that is liable and should be accountable. However, if we're talking about agentic systems, let's suppose that we were at the agentic AI stage right now, and the agentic AI goes off and makes a decision. It's not clear that it's the developer that is accountable because they aren't the one who they didn't predetermine the software and stuff, right? The system itself kind of made its own decision, right? And so the only reason I bring up that nuance is just to say, yeah, this is a very gray area that we're in, and there isn't clarity at this point, and we haven't quite figured out our way through the forest just yet. So it's
No,
interesting.
and it is, but I mean that's also why people, organizations need to start moving on this and finding their
Mm-hmm.
champions now so that they
Mm-hmm.
can enter the sandbox and start finding their partners and finding people who can help guide how to build these systems. So for example, Atomic 47 Labs, we build and orchestrate agentic systems. That's what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And there are ways of, almost meta building where you can build systems that look at themselves to try and mitigate redundancy. But a lot of it has to do as well with having appropriate guardrailing, expert systems, and having people within the enterprise who are, designing the system to match the enterprise, but then also having people in the enterprise who are capable of overseeing it, and working with partners like Atomic, like Kama, to find systems and experts who can help you identify and design the systems and identify the talent that you're going to need in your organization to implement safely and sustainably, so that, again, it's not one and done, it's building a capability.
Yeah. Now, the next question is kind of tags on to this. So AI moves as we're seeing AI moving from simply answering questions to really taking actions in the real world. The stakes go up dramatically. I mean, the jumbo jet's a great example, right? That if we implement AI systems in the jumbo jet to land the plane, it's not just giving you an answer and oops, if it made a mistake, it's not that big a deal when it just gives you an answer. However, the stakes are really high now because it's going to land the plane, and either all the people on the plane are could possibly be at risk or not, one way or the other. So what changes when AI moves from that decision making to the execution mode? How should organizations be preparing for this?
Right. So again, aviation is a great example. You wouldn't, sit and code a system to land a plane and then slap it on a jumbo jet full of passengers and say, give it a try, see what happens, right?
Let's see what
But
happens. Exactly. Yeah.
that's kind of what we do a lot of the time with AI tech, is almost like this all or nothing, rather than, again, building up strategically. So, coding it, trying it on small, I'm not intimately familiar with how they design these systems in aviations, but I would suppose that, you're doing a lot of modeling, but then you're starting with like smaller planes with no one in them. Let's see what happens, right? In very controlled environments where if the plane just crashes and burns, like, okay, you've lost a plane and you've learned a lot. And that's the point, right? So it's ramping up to and feeling confident in doing all the testing and the edge case testing that's required for you to be confident it's going to operate. And it may take a long time and a lot of testing before you get to the level where you're okay with it landing a jumbo jet full of passengers. Like, we're not there yet in the aviation space, but they're working on it because they see how one day we're likely going to be there with that capability. So again, it's working up to that capability. But the other thing I think we don't think about is having brave spaces, not safe spaces, but brave spaces where people can share what worked as well as what did not work. Because as we know, right, we learn, not like when it works the way we thought it would, we feel good and put a checkbox. But where we actually learn is when we cut ourselves with a knife and then we're like, whoa, I'm not holding the bread like that ever again when I cut it, because like that was no bueno, right? And so that's the type of, if we're building responsible tech, part of that is having spaces where the people building it can openly share what's not working as well as what is, because that's where you need to think about, okay, why isn't it working and what can we do? And people aren't, sweeping things under the rug, but rather they're surfacing. That's what you need.
And I like the term that you're using there, the brave spaces. It kind of reminds me of, I think jet fighter pilots go through this type of thing where they're reprimanded if they don't fess up on things. And part of the idea is to say, tell me where you think you went wrong so that we can all improve on on our flying skills and or whatever. Interesting. So last question for you, Jennifer. So let's talk a little bit about accountability, or we're coming back to that idea about accountability. In a lot of areas like those which involve human systems, think about HR, think about healthcare, accountability becomes a kind of difficult to trace sometimes. How should organizations think about accountability when, cause and effect really isn't crystal clear?
Yeah, it's a good question and one that people are really wrangling with.
Hmm.
Right now, there's a lot of human in the loop in
Hmm.
systems like that, as there should be for a
Yeah,
couple reasons. One, it's
right.
the human decision maker that is responsible for the decision made right now, right? So, to the point, again, it's about thinking about what's appropriate for the system and context that you're using the technology in, right? So, in healthcare, for example, fully autonomous diagnostics from patient interview to like surgical procedure, wholly not appropriate. I think we can all be on that bandwagon. Using it in specific context to support decision making and systems management, absolutely. So, the example everyone pulls on a lot is image recognition for cancer diagnostics, for example, is outperforming now, like reliably. Does it mean it's 100% accurate? No, but neither are humans, might we add. But what is important is transparency, right? So when you're using a system like that and it's making a diagnostic on an image, it is transparently telling the care team, here's why I'm making this decision. Here's information I feel I'm missing. Here's some things I'm not sure about, surfacing all those different aspects so that it's a true diagnostics tool that aligns with how clinical decision making is done and the skills and training of the people, in this case, a surgical care team perhaps, that are using it, right? The information an IT specialist would want, different, very different, right? And so it's also ensuring that a system is transparently surfacing all the different types of information that different experts need to know to
Mhm.
have that operating well in the context it's deployed in.
So, for all intents and purposes, we're still kind of, I guess the phase that we're in today is we still have human in the loop. The human is kind of taking that accountability step. Like, the perfect example being the specialist or the doctor who's going to make a call in terms of what type of surgery to do, but that they're being augmented by the AI, in their research, or maybe a discussion point to say, well, what if we use this procedure instead of that procedure, et cetera.
Yep.
I think that's what you're getting at, right?
Yep. Another great use, and I know I have friends who are doctors, so scribing. That's another use where you're having systems that are collecting, doctors who sit down at the end of the day after a day of seeing patients in the clinic, and it's taking all the information from the test results, their notes, all the things,
Yes.
and it's putting
Yes.
together an automated, you know, report at the end of the day for each
Yeah.
patient. And then they review those at the end of the day very carefully to make sure all the information they think should be there is, and all the information that
Mhm.
is there is accurate, because both those things can happen.
Yeah.
But and I'm sure not everyone is delighted with it, and I'm sure it's got its bits that are annoying like any other tech. But by and large, most people who use it say it saves them between an hour to two every day. And so you
Yes.
multiply that, it's a lot,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But the caution is, of course, is you have to design these systems in a way where the human engages fully. So if the system,
Mm.
if the clinician is not carefully reading
Mhm.
those
Mhm.
AI
Mhm.
generated
Mhm.
transcripts,
Mhm.
we've got a
Mhm.
problem, right?
Yes.
And
Yes,
and
absolutely.
they are ultimately, it's very clear there, though, as well, that they are accountable for whatever they submit on
Yeah.
that report,
Yeah.
right? So, because
Yep.
the accountability is clear, because it's a regulated practice, it works in this use case.
Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, good. Thank you for that case. In fact, on a personal basis, I have to say the doctor's office that I've been at, I think over the past 6 months or so, they've actually started going to scribes, or, having the AI basically, take the notes for the doctor. And I would say for the first time in my life, the doctor was on time. And when I arrived, bingo, I just kind of walked in, which was awesome. I loved it. So anyway, hopefully there's some hope in there,
Right.
little
And
elements
it's a
of hope.
great example too of it's not replacing the professional. It's
Absolutely.
enabling the professional to focus on what they want, which
Exactly.
is patient
Exactly.
care and diagnostics.
100% it lets them focus on what they need to be focused on as opposed to the silly other things that they've had on their plate. So
Who of
Jennifer,
us
thank
likes
you.
doing paperwork, right?
Oh yeah, exactly. Yes, if we knew what jobs really were, but anyway, that's for another discussion sometime. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us and for this insightful discussion on what it takes to build responsible AI systems in the real world. So from how we think about bias, we started off there in context to designing in that gray zone, the high trust systems like the aviation that we discussed a little bit earlier, and these critical ideas that organizations really need to get right. So that's especially true when AI moves from the answer domain into the real world action domain. So I think that's pretty much where we're standing right now. We're just starting to get into that realm. Dr. Jennifer Boger is a principal at Atomic 47 Labs and adjunct professor at the University of Waterloo and UBC. She is also a research scientist at UW Research Institute for Aging. And that wraps up another episode of Responsible AI in Action. In each conversation, we speak with leaders across the AI industry and those working on enterprise transformation to explore what's actually working in the field. We look at what's working, what's not working, and how to deploy AI responsibly in the real world. Thank you to everyone who's watching for joining us. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Responsible AI in Action.